The alarm was the first thing to pierce the blackness. Not the gentle, rising chime of a morning cycle, but the shrieking, metallic scream of catastrophic failure. I came to with a gasp, the taste of copper and ozone in my mouth. My head slammed back against the worn padding of the escape pod's command chair as a secondary impact shuddered through the tiny vessel. Red lights strobed across the cramped interior, painting my strained face in flashes of bloody light. The main viewport, a thick pane of reinforced polymer, showed me hell. My ship, the long-haul freighter Starlight Dawn, was no more. It was a cloud of glittering, expanding debris, tumbling in the silent, indifferent vacuum. A section of the primary hull, with the ship's name still partially visible, spun lazily past, trailing frozen vapor like a dying breath. The silence was the worst part. On the other side of this thin shell, a vessel that had been my home for 3 years had been torn apart without a sound. My mind, the mind of a navigator, a man who lives by data and vectors, struggled to process the input. Catastrophic drive failure. That was the only logical explanation. We'd been in a stable transit lane, clear of all debris. It shouldn't have happened. My training kicked in, pushing down the wave of nausea and grief. Panic is a luxury you can't afford when the universe is actively trying to kill you. I slapped the console, bringing up the pod's diagnostics. The screen flickered, lines of green text scrolling past too quickly to read before settling on a summary page. Each line was a nail in my coffin. Communications array, offline. Hull integrity, 87%. Primary power, failed. Backup power, 4%. Life support, active. Oxygen reserves, 71 hours, 48 minutes. I stared at that last line. 3 days. I had 3 days to be found in a sector of space that was largely empty, without a way to call for help. The pod's distress beacon was tied to the main power. Useless. I ran a bioscan of the immediate vicinity, a desperate, foolish hope flaring in my chest. Nothing. No other pods. No heat signatures that matched a human life sign. The Dawn had a crew of 12. Now it had a crew of 1. Me. Ryan Harper. The sole survivor. The thought brought no relief, only a profound, crushing weight. My fingers flew across the navigation console, rerouting the trickle of power from non-essential systems to the long-range passive sensors. It was my only play. I couldn't transmit, but maybe, just maybe, I could receive something, or detect something. A ship, an outpost, an old satellite, anything. The scanner whirred weakly, a pathetic sound in the suffocating quiet. For hours I watched the screen, watching the sensor sweep paint agonizingly slow arcs across the display. Nothing. Just the faint background radiation of the cosmos and the ghosts of 2 dead stars that defined this empty quadrant. Then, a flicker. A tiny, anonymous reading at the edge of the scanner's range. It wasn't a signal. It was a mass signature. A huge one. My pulse quickened. I amplified the reading, feeding more of my precious power into the array. The image resolved slowly, pixel by agonizing pixel. It wasn't one object. It was thousands. A massive, densely packed cluster of metallic objects, held together in a loose, sprawling congregation. The nav computer cross-referenced the location with stellar charts. A red flag popped up on the screen, accompanied by a string of text. Warning: unstable gravitational anomaly. Lagrange pocket L3. Avoidance advised. Old spacers had a different name for it. A name I'd only ever heard in cautionary tales whispered in station bars. The Sargasso Sea of Stars. A dead spot in space. A perfect equilibrium between the gravitational pull of the 2 stellar remnants. Anything that drifted too close got caught. and it never left. It was a graveyard, but it was also my only chance. I used the last dregs of the pod's maneuvering thrusters, a series of short, sharp bursts that sent me on a slow, calculated trajectory toward the anomaly. The journey took the better part of a day. As I got closer, the true, horrifying scale of the place revealed itself. It was a fleet of ghosts. Dozens, maybe hundreds of ships, all tangled together in a slow-motion dance of death. I saw ancient colony ships, their hulls pitted and scarred by centuries of micrometeoroids. Sleek, angular military frigates floated beside fat-bellied ore haulers. There were small prospector ships, luxury yachts, and the skeletal remains of vessels so old I couldn't even identify their design. They were all silent, all dark, locked in this cosmic dead end. My eyes scanned the ghost fleet, looking for a savior. Most were too damaged, hulls breached, engines cold for centuries. But one stood out. It was a newer design, a scientific research vessel, its white hull still relatively clean. The name was stenciled on the side in stark black letters. CRV Magellan. Celestial Research Vessel, Magellan. Its hull was almost entirely intact, and through the viewport, I could see the faintest glimmer of emergency lights flickering within its corridors. Power, life support, hope. There was no way to dock. The pod's systems were shot. It would have to be a manual transfer. I suited up, my hands shaking slightly as I double-checked the seals on my helmet and gloves. I nudged the pod as close as I dared, the proximity alarm screaming as its hull scraped against a twisted strut from some long-dead ship. The Magellan was about 50 feet away, a silent, white tomb. "Okay, Ryan," I whispered, my own voice unnervingly loud inside the helmet. "Just a little spacewalk." I cycled the outer hatch and pushed myself out into the void. The cold was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to suck the warmth right out of my suit. Using my suit's low-power thrusters, I crossed the gap, my magnetic boots clanking against the Magellan's hull. I made my way to an emergency airlock, the universal sigils still clearly visible. The manual release lever was stiff. I had to put my whole body into it, my muscles screaming in protest. With a groaning screech of metal, the outer door slid open. I climbed inside, sealing the outer door behind me before engaging the pressurization sequence. A hiss of air filled the small chamber. When the indicator turned green, I twisted the release on my helmet. The seal broke with a soft sigh. I took a deep, cautious breath. The air was stale, cold, and thin, but it was breathable. I pushed open the inner door and stepped into a long, dark corridor. The only light came from the red emergency strips running along the floor, casting long, dancing shadows. And the silence. It was deeper, more profound than the vacuum of space. It was a heavy, waiting silence. The silence of a place where something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. The inner airlock door hissed shut behind me, the sound echoing down the corridor like a closing tomb. I stood there for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The silence was a physical weight. In my pod, there had been the constant hum of life support, the crackle of static. Here, there was nothing. No ventilation, no engine hum, not even the subtle creak of a ship under power. It was the absolute zero of sound. I unlatched my helmet, pulling it off and clipping it to my belt. The stale air tasted of filtered plastic and cold metal. The silence became deafening. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, the whisper of my own breathing. My first priority was power. Following the emergency lighting, I made my way through the silent, intersecting corridors. The layout was standard for a research vessel of its class, a design I knew well. My navigator's brain automatically began mapping the ship, filing away junctions and deck levels. The ship felt preserved. There were no signs of battle, no hull breaches, just an unnerving stillness, as if it were a perfect scale model. I found the engineering deck 3 levels down. The massive housing for the primary reactor was cold and dark, but the auxiliary generator, a smaller, more robust unit for emergency situations, looked intact. I pulled open the main control panel. It was a mess of wiring, but the core principles were the same on any ship. For the next hour, I worked methodically, rerouting primary conduits, bypassing fried circuits, and coaxing the old machinery back to life. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the delicate connections, but I pushed on. Finally, I slammed the main breaker into place. With a deep, resonant hum that vibrated up through the soles of my boots, the Magellan began to wake. Lights flickered on overhead, bathing the corridor in a weak, yellowish glow. The ventilation system kicked in with a low, steady whoosh, circulating the stale air. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Hope, cold and fragile, sparked in my chest. I wasn't just a castaway anymore. I was a captain of a ghost ship, but a ship nonetheless. My next stop was the galley. I was starving, running on adrenaline and the last of my pod's nutrient paste. What I found was baffling. The galley was pristine. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the new lights. The food synthesizers were fully stocked. In the cold storage lockers, I found vacuum-sealed packs of real food. Meats, vegetables, bread. Enough to last a full crew for months. It was untouched, as if the crew had vanished an hour before dinner. I heated a ration pack, the savory steam a welcome sensation, and devoured it standing right there, my eyes scanning the eerily normal room. The medbay was the same story. Cabinets were filled with injectors, dermal regenerators, and broad-spectrum antivirals. Everything was neatly organized, fully stocked. This ship wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. It had everything I needed to wait for rescue or even attempt to repair the main comms array. The feeling of dread that had been my constant companion began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. I made my way to the crew's common area, a larger room with worn couches and a central table, and that's when I saw it. On the table sat a chessboard, the pieces frozen in the middle of a game. A black knight was poised to take a white bishop. Beside the board were 2 ceramic mugs, dark rings of dried coffee staining their bottoms. The scene was so mundane, so human, that it was utterly terrifying. This wasn't a ship that had been evacuated. This was a ship where life had simply stopped. The image of 2 crew members engrossed in their game, laughing and talking, only to vanish into thin air, sent a shiver down my spine. It was on my way to the bridge that I saw the first thing that was truly wrong. On a bulkhead wall in a narrow service corridor, there was a stain. It was a dark, almost black smear about the size of my hand. It wasn't paint or oil. It looked organic, with a strange, resinous texture like hardened sap. It had a bizarre, almost fractal pattern to it, and it seemed to absorb the light from my headlamp, creating a patch of pure darkness. It was utterly alien to the sterile, metallic environment of the ship. I reached out to touch it, then recoiled. Some primal instinct screamed at me not to. I made a mental note of its location and moved on, my newfound optimism souring into a familiar, cold dread. The bridge was the heart of the ship, a wide, dark space with a panoramic view of the star-strewn graveyard outside. I sat in the captain's chair, the worn material cool against my back, and began interfacing with the ship's main computer. I needed access to the logs to find out what had happened to the crew, what had brought the Magellan here. As I worked, typing commands into the console, I heard it. A distinct, sharp scrape. It sounded like metal on metal, and it came from the ceiling, seemingly from inside the ventilation shaft directly above my head. I froze, every muscle tensed. I strained my ears, listening to the hum of the computers and the whisper of the vents. Nothing. The sound wasn't repeated. I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I was holding. The ship is old, I told myself. It's just the hull settling as the power comes back on. Thermal expansion. My logical mind provided a perfectly reasonable explanation, but my gut wasn't buying it. I pushed the sound from my mind and focused on the task at hand. The primary ship's log was corrupted, wiped clean, but the science department's internal servers were still intact. Their files, however, were locked behind a heavy layer of encryption. It took me another 2 hours of focused work, using every backdoor and command prompt trick I knew, but I finally broke through. A directory of files appeared on the screen. Most were data readouts and stellar cartography notes, but one folder was labeled Acquisition 734, Video Journals. I clicked on it. My search for answers was over. My nightmare was just beginning. The first file was dated 6 months ago. The face that appeared on the screen was bright, intelligent, and filled with an almost manic excitement. A text overlay identified her as Dr. Evelyn Reed, head of xenobiology. She was in a sterile white lab, her dark hair tied back, a pair of protective goggles pushed up onto her forehead. "Journal entry 1, she began, her voice crisp and professional, though unable to hide her glee. "We've done it. After 3 years of surveying the asteroid fields in this sector, we've found it. Acquisition 734. It's magnificent." The camera panned to a transparent containment unit. Inside, resting on a sterile pedestal, was a shard of black, crystalline rock. It was no bigger than a human fist, but it seemed to drink the light. Initial scans are inconclusive, but it appears to be a non-carbon-based crystalline life form, potentially silicon-based with a complex internal structure that pulses with a low-level energy signature. This is the discovery of a lifetime. The biology textbooks will be rewritten. I skipped ahead a week. Dr. Reed was back on screen, her expression still excited, but now tinged with a scientific intensity that bordered on obsession. Entry 4. We've had a breakthrough. A stunning one. On a hunch, I introduced a nutrient solution with simple organic compounds into the sample's environment. The reaction was immediate. The crystal, it's not just a passive organism, it's a catalyst. It doesn't consume the organic matter in a traditional sense. It rewrites it. It breaks it down to a molecular level and reassembles it into more of its own crystalline structure. It's a form of replication I've never seen. It's perfect. It's beautiful. She smiled, a wide, unnerving smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The next log was dated 3 days later. The change was jarring. Dr. Reed looked exhausted. Dark circles hung under her eyes, and her lab coat was rumpled. The manic energy was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing anxiety. "Entry 6, she said, her voice a strained whisper. "There's been an incident. Lab assistant Peters was running a diagnostic and reported a small crack in the containment field. It was sealed in seconds, but he was exposed. He's been placed in medical quarantine. He's running a high fever, complaining of muscle aches and severe paranoia. He says he can feel something growing inside him. He claims it's singing to him in his bones. The medical team thinks it's just the fever-induced delirium. I'm not so sure." The next entry was a frantic, handheld recording. The image was shaky, the lighting poor. It was Dr. Reed again, but she was barely recognizable. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, her eyes wide with terror. She was hiding in what looked like a supply closet. "He's dead. Peters, he died 3 hours ago. We thought it was over, but it wasn't. An hour ago, his body,
It started to change. The skin turned black and hard like the crystal. Then the quarantine doors. God, the doors were reinforced titanium and they buckled. Something broke out. It wasn't Peter's anymore. It was wrong. A loud metallic bang echoed from somewhere outside the closet, and she flinched violently, clamping a hand over her mouth. The recording cut out. That was her last journal entry. The rest of the files were raw security footage, short, chaotic clips with no audio. My blood ran cold as I watched them. A darkened corridor, illuminated only by emergency lights. A sudden blur of motion, too fast to be human. The glint of something long and sharp. A crew member with a pulse rifle, backing away, firing blindly into the darkness. The footage then showed the ceiling panel above him bursting downward and a black, spindly limb lashing out. The camera feed cut to static. Another clip. The mess hall. Crew members huddled behind overturned tables. The main doors bent inward with a screech of tortured metal before being torn from their hinges. The camera angle was too high to see what entered, but I saw the shadows it cast. They were long, unnatural, and moved with a terrifying, insect-like speed. The final file was audio only, labeled Bridge Final. The voice was deep, laced with static and sheer terror. I recognized the commanding tone of a ship's captain. It must have been Andrei Volkov, the Magellan's skipper.
"This is Captain Volkov to any surviving crew," he said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over. We've lost the ship. They're everywhere. They're in the walls." A series of heavy, rhythmic thuds could be heard in the background. "I'm initiating a full reactor core overload. Manual sequence. It's the only way to be sure this plague doesn't spread. God forgive us." There was a loud crash, the sound of shattering glass. Volkov screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound of pure agony. It was cut short by a wet, tearing noise. Then, a new sound filled the silence. A series of sharp, rapid clicks, like a dozen stilettos tapping on a metal floor. The clicking grew louder, closer to the microphone, and then the recording ended. I pushed back from the console, my chair scraping loudly against the deck. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The logical, ordered world I lived in had just been shattered. The crew of the Magellan hadn't gone mad. They hadn't succumbed to some space-borne psychosis. They had been hunted. They had been turned into living incubators for something alien and monstrous. I looked up at the vent cover above my head, the source of the sound I had so easily dismissed. It wasn't the ship settling. It was the clicking. And the chilling realization washed over me. I had spent hours restoring power and life support to this ship. I hadn't just found a tomb. I had woken it up. And I was not alone. My pragmatism, the core of who I was, had been replaced by a primal, lizard-brain fear. But it was that same pragmatism that kept me from curling up into a ball under the console. Fear was a data point, an indicator of a threat. The threat was real. Now I had to formulate a response. Running blindly was not a plan. I needed to know my enemy, and I needed a weapon. I remembered seeing the security station on my initial sweep of the ship. It was one deck up near the main airlocks. My movements were now deliberate, quiet. Every creak of the deck plates, every hum of a relay sounded like a predator's footfall. I kept my eyes on the ceiling vents, my hand resting on the heavy wrench I'd grabbed from the engineering toolkit. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing.
The security locker was, thankfully, unlocked. Inside, racked neatly, were 4 standard-issue pulse rifles and a pair of sidearms. I grabbed one of the rifles. It was heavier than I expected, cold and solid in my hands. A quick check of the power cell showed it was at 20%. I rummaged through the locker, my desperation growing. I found a box of spare cells, but when I tested them, they were all dead, completely drained. The security team must have fought, expended their ammunition, and lost. 20%. It would have to be enough. My new objective was clear. I had to get to the science lab. It was the source of this nightmare, the place Dr. Reed had called Ground Zero. If I was going to understand what I was up against, I needed to see where it all began. I pulled up the ship's schematic on a nearby terminal, memorizing the quickest route. The journey to the science deck was a journey into the heart of the ship's infection. The strange black resin I'd seen earlier was no longer an isolated smear. It was becoming more prevalent. At first, it was just patches in the corners of rooms or at the junction of a wall and the ceiling. But the closer I got to the lab, the thicker it became. It started to form distinct patterns on the bulkheads, dark branching lines that looked unsettlingly like veins running through the ship's metal skin. They pulsed with a faint internal luminescence in the beam of my headlamp, a slow, rhythmic beat like a sleeping heart. The air grew thick and heavy, with a strange, cloying organic smell, like damp soil and burnt sugar. The signs of the crew's last, desperate struggle were everywhere. Deep gouges, far too uniform and sharp to be from any tool, were carved into the metal walls. One corridor was littered with spent pulse rifle casings. A blast door was dented outward, as if something immensely powerful had tried to punch its way through from the other side. Each new piece of evidence painted a more vivid, more terrifying picture of the chaos that had consumed this ship. The doors to the xenobiology lab were sealed, a quarantine warning flashing on the control panel. I used the security override code I'd pulled from the bridge computer. The doors hissed open reluctantly, grinding on something. The resin. It had started to seal the doors shut from the inside. I stepped into the lab, and the breath caught in my throat. It was a desecrated temple of science. Equipment was smashed, consoles torn apart, and the resin was everywhere. It dripped from the ceiling in thick, viscous strands. It coated tables and chairs in a glistening black shroud. It had completely engulfed a bank of computers, their screens now dark, dead eyes in a monstrous organic mask. In the center of the room, where Dr. Reed's first video log had shown the pristine containment unit, there was nothing but a stand of twisted metal and shattered glass-like fragments. The cage was broken. The animal was loose. My light swept across the room, and I saw it. A personal data pad, half submerged in a pool of the black substance near a toppled workstation. Dr. Reed's. I pried it free with the barrel of my rifle. The resin made a wet sucking sound as it released its grip. Miraculously, the device still had power. It contained her private notes, the thoughts she couldn't bring herself to record on official video logs. "It communicates," I read. "Not with sound, but on some frequency I can't measure. It promises unity, a single perfect consciousness. Some of the crew are succumbing. They say it's beautiful. They're letting it in." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a monster. It was a conversion event. It's a perfect parasite. It uses the host's biomass to create a new form, but it needs more than that. It needs a nexus, a warm, stable environment to act as a womb, a nest. It is building a nest somewhere on the ship, using the bodies of the crew as raw material. God, the sounds they made. That's when I heard it again. That same sharp, scraping sound. But this time it wasn't distant. It wasn't above me. It was close. It was coming from beneath the raised deck plates of the lab floor, just a few feet away from where I stood. Scrape. Scrape. Click. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized me. This was its lair, its home. I wasn't an intruder. I was prey that had just walked into the spider's web. I scrambled backward out of the lab, not even thinking, just reacting. I slammed my hand on the door control panel. The doors hissed shut, slower this time, fighting against the encroaching resin. A heavy, resounding thud slammed against the inside of the door, making the entire bulkhead shudder. It knew I was here. It knew I had found its birthplace. I didn't wait for a second knock. I turned and ran, the pulse rifle feeling as useless as a child's toy in my hands. I had to get off this ship. My initial plan to find supplies and wait was suicide. The only way out was back to my pod. But my pod was out of fuel, and the only place to get more fuel cells was the one place my mind now screamed at me to avoid: the deep, dark cargo bay. The flight from the science lab had been a blur of adrenaline and terror. I found a small, defensible storage room, sealed the door, and spent what felt like hours with my back against the cold metal, pulse rifle aimed at the entrance, just listening. The ship remained silent, too silent. I knew it was a deception. The creature wasn't gone. It was waiting, hunting. My situation had been distilled to a single, brutal equation. My escape pod needed fuel. The ship's schematics, still burned into my memory from my time on the bridge, showed the spare fuel cells were stored in the main cargo bay, on the lowest deck. It was the furthest point from my current position, and it was in the direction the spreading resin seemed to be originating from. The path to my salvation led directly through the heart of the nightmare. The descent through the technical decks was like entering a different world. The clean, sterile corridors of the upper levels gave way to a grimy, industrial labyrinth of pipes and conduits. And here, the infection was no longer just a creeping stain. The black resin coated everything. It wasn't just on the walls. It was the walls. It had subsumed the metal bulkheads, creating a new organic surface that was slick and wet to the touch. The air grew warm and humid, carrying the same cloying sweet rot smell from the lab, but much stronger now. It felt like I was walking down the throat of some colossal beast. The ship's metallic hum was gone, replaced by a low, throbbing vibration that I could feel in the soles of my boots, the same slow, rhythmic pulse I'd seen in the resin's veins. The entrance to the cargo bay was a massive, pressure-sealed hatch. It stood slightly ajar, the thick metal warped and bent, held open by thick, ropey tendrils of the black resin. I squeezed through the gap, my rifle held out in front of me, and stepped inside. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a cargo bay. It was a cathedral of horrors. The vast, cavernous space had been completely transformed. The floor, ceiling, and walls were covered in a thick, pulsating layer of the organic material, sculpted into grotesque alien architecture. Rib-like arches curved overhead, meeting in the center of the ceiling where a large, faintly glowing sack hung like a diseased chandelier. The air was thick and hot, and the low, throbbing hum was deafeningly loud here. It was the sound of a monstrous heart. My headlamp beam cut through the gloom, revealing the true purpose of this place. Fused to the walls, suspended by thick, cable-like tendrils of resin, were cocoons, dozens of them. They were vaguely humanoid in shape and size, their surfaces glistening and semi-translucent. I could see dark, contorted shapes suspended within them. The crew of the Magellan. This was their tomb. This was the nest Dr. Reed had written about. A morbid, horrifying curiosity, a need to know, overpowered my instinct to flee. I approached the nearest cocoon, the deck squishing slightly under my boots. I could see the faint outline of a face pressed against the interior wall of the sack. Eyes closed, mouth open in a silent scream.
The uniform insignia was still visible, a junior engineer's patch. I raised the heavy wrench I still carried, its metallic edge seeming profane in this organic space, and brought it down hard on the cocoon's surface. It didn't shatter. It split, with a wet, tearing sound like rotten canvas. A thick, amniotic fluid, smelling foully of decay, gushed out, splashing over my boots. The body slumped forward, held in place by resinous cords. It was the engineer, or what was left of him. His flesh was pale and waxy, but the real horror was his chest. The entire rib cage had been shattered and blown outward from the inside. He had been a biological incubator, a womb for whatever horrors this thing spawned. As the beam of my headlamp illuminated the gruesome sight, a flicker of movement caught my eye from across the bay. I snapped my head up, sweeping the light across the far wall. One of the cocoons, larger than the others, was twitching. It shuddered violently, once, then twice. A network of cracks appeared on its surface. Then, with a sound like wet leather tearing, the front of the cocoon ripped open. A long, impossibly thin black limb unfurled, ending in a trio of scythe-like claws that scraped against the resinous wall. Another limb followed, then a narrow, elongated head, devoid of any eyes or discernible features, just a smooth, chitinous surface. With a final, sickeningly wet crunch, the creature pulled itself free from its ruptured birthplace and dropped to the deck below. It was 8 feet tall, a nightmarish silhouette of sharp angles and unnatural joints. Its body was a glossy insectoid black, the same material as the resin that covered the ship. It stood on 2 digigraded legs, its long arms ending in those terrifying claws. It unfolded itself to its full height, its eyeless head twitching, tilting as if tasting the air. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its blank face directly toward me. It couldn't see me, but it knew exactly where I was. The world narrowed to the creature and the pulse rifle in my hands. I didn't think, I just reacted. I squeezed the trigger. A bolt of superheated plasma erupted from the barrel, striking the creature square in the chest. The impact threw it back a step, and the air filled with the smell of sizzling chitin. But it didn't fall. It let out a high-pitched, chittering shriek that echoed through the cavernous bay, a sound that bypassed my ears and burrowed straight into my skull. Then it charged. Its speed was breathtaking. It didn't run, it flowed across the deck, its long limbs eating up the distance in a terrifying arachnid scuttle. I fired again, a wild shot that seared a black scar on the resinous wall beside it. There was no time to aim, no time for anything but flight. I spun around and sprinted for the gap in the cargo bay doors. The chase was a frantic, desperate scramble through the infected bowels of the ship. The creature was relentless, its claws scraping against the metal decking right behind me, the sound a constant, terrifying rhythm driving me forward. It was faster than me on the straightaways, but I had one advantage. I was a navigator. I knew the layout of ships like this one. I knew the shortcuts, the access tunnels, the logic of their construction. I ducked into a cramped maintenance corridor and slammed my palm against the emergency door control. The thick metal door hissed shut, just as the creature slammed into it from the other side. The entire bulkhead buckled with the force of the impact. It wouldn't hold for long. I ran, my lungs burning, my mind racing. I used the ship against it. I rounded a corner and shot out a power conduit on the wall, showering the corridor behind me in a cascade of blinding sparks. I heard the creature screech in what sounded like pain or confusion, buying me a few more precious seconds. I scrambled up a service ladder to the deck above, then kicked it away, sending it clattering to the floor below. I was thinking like a cornered animal, using terrain and traps to survive. My goal was the bridge. It was the most fortified position on the entire vessel, designed to withstand micrometeoroid impacts and radiation bursts. If I could get there, I could lock myself in. I burst out onto the main habitation deck, the cleaner, better-lit corridors, a stark contrast to the organic nightmare below. I didn't slow down. I could hear it coming, the sound of it tearing through the ship's infrastructure to follow me. I reached the bridge and threw myself through the doorway, my hands already reaching for the main lockdown panel. I slapped the large red button. With a deep, satisfying thud of heavy machinery, a slab of reinforced armor plating slid down, sealing the main entrance. A split second later, a tremendous impact shook the entire room, followed by the high-pitched scrape of claws on reinforced metal. I had made it. I scrambled to the security console and activated the external camera feed for the bridge entrance. The monitor flickered to life, showing me the thing that was hunting me. It was methodically examining the armored door, its eyeless head tilting back and forth. It ran a claw along the seam, searching for a weakness. It tapped the surface in different places, as if testing for structural integrity. I watched, my heart pounding, a cold sweat beading on my forehead. This was not a mindless beast. It was intelligent. It was a patient, calculating predator, and I was its trapped prey. The siege began. For hours, the creature stayed there. Sometimes it would slam against the door with furious, startling violence. Other times it would just patrol, its silent, menacing presence visible on the camera. I was a prisoner in my own fortress. I could survive here for days, maybe weeks. The bridge had its own emergency life support and rations. But the creature wasn't leaving. It knew I was in here, and it would wait. Trapped, with the rhythmic scraping at the door a constant reminder of my mortality, a desperate plan began to form in my mind. The words of Captain Volkov's final message echoed in my head. I am initiating a full reactor core overload. It's the only way. He had failed, but he had the right idea. I couldn't escape this ship while that thing was still alive. I had to kill it. And if I couldn't kill it with a rifle, I would use the entire damn ship as a weapon. I pulled up the Magellan's full engineering schematics on the main console. My eyes traced the power conduits, the coolant lines, the plasma vents. The direct route to the engineering deck was down the main central corridor, the same corridor the creature was currently guarding. It was a suicide run. But then I saw another path, a dangerous, insane path, but a path nonetheless. There was an emergency EVA access point on the outer hull of the bridge. I could go outside, crawl along the ship's superstructure, and re-enter through the engineering section's external maintenance hatch.
The plan was madness. I would be exposed, vulnerable, in the cold, silent void. But staying here was a death sentence. At least this way, I'd be fighting back. I went to the small emergency locker at the back of the bridge and began to pull on an EVA suit. My hands were steady. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was mixed with something else, a grim, focused resolve. The hunt was over. Now I was the one setting the trap. The process of depressurizing the bridge was eerily quiet. The loud hiss of escaping air faded into a profound silence, broken only by the sound of my own breathing inside the helmet. The main viewport, my window to the Sargasso Sea, now looked like an open door to oblivion. I checked my suit's seals one last time, magnetized my boots to the deck, and opened the outer hatch. Stepping out onto the hull of the Magellan was like stepping into a dream. The universe stretched out around me, a tapestry of infinite black velvet, scattered with the cold, distant diamonds of stars. The ghost fleet of the graveyard surrounded us, silent and majestic in their decay. For a moment, the sheer, terrifying beauty of it all paralyzed me. Then I remembered what was hunting me. My magnetic boots clanked heavily on the hull as I began my slow, methodical trek toward the engineering section. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. One wrong step, One slip of a magnetic boot, and I would be sent tumbling into the void, another piece of debris to join the dead fleet. The silence was absolute. I was utterly, completely alone out here. It was a vulnerability more profound than any I had ever known. I had covered about 100 feet, moving along the spine of the ship, when a flicker of movement caught my eye. It was on the lower section of the hull, near the cargo bay, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the pulse rifle clamped to my suit's hip. The shadow unfolded, revealing a familiar, nightmarish silhouette. The creature. It had emerged from a hull breach near the nest, its black chitinous body a perfect camouflage against the star-dusted blackness. It moved with an impossible, terrifying grace, its claws finding purchase on the metal hull as easily as my magnetic boots. It was perfectly adapted to the vacuum, a true creature of the void, and it was coming for me. The slow, cautious walk became a desperate race. I pushed myself forward, my boots clanking a frantic rhythm on the hull. The creature was faster, its long limbs covering ground with an unnatural, loping gait. It wasn't just moving along the hull, it was bounding from one protruding antenna to another, using the ship's own structure as a jungle gym. The maintenance hatch for the engineering section was still 50 feet away. I wasn't going to make it. It was closing the distance too quickly. My mind raced, scanning my surroundings for any advantage. My eyes locked on to a small communications relay dish mounted on the hull between me and the creature. An idea, born of sheer desperation, flashed in my mind. I unslung my pulse rifle, aimed, and fired a single precise shot at the base of the dish's mounting strut. The plasma bolt vaporized the connection. The 3-foot-wide dish, freed from the hull, shot away from the hull, tumbling directly into the creature's path. The monster, caught by surprise, was forced to change its trajectory, leaping to the side to avoid the spinning piece of debris. There was only a moment's hesitation, a few seconds of distraction, but it was all I needed. I threw myself forward, covering the last few feet in a clumsy, half-running, half-floating scramble. I slammed my hand against the hatch's activation panel. With a hiss of compressed air, the outer door slid open. I dove inside, my body crashing hard against the inner wall of the airlock. I slapped the control to close the outer door just as the creature's spindly black form appeared in the opening. The door slammed shut, shearing the very tip off one of its claws, which clattered harmlessly to the floor of the airlock. I lay there for a moment, my breath fogging the inside of my visor, my heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I had made it. I was safe. For now. I repressurized the airlock and stumbled into the engineering section. The vast chamber was filled with the low, powerful hum of the auxiliary reactor core. Pipes and conduits crisscrossed the space, and the air was hot and smelled of ozone and hot metal. I made my way to the main control panel. It was just as the schematics had shown, but it was damaged. Sparks flew from a cracked console, and several key interfaces were dark. Captain Volkov must have tried to start the overload from here, and failed. I couldn't trigger the explosion from this panel. I would have to initiate the sequence manually, right at the core itself. As I turned toward the pulsating heart of the reactor, my eyes were drawn to the ceiling. Several of the large grated ventilation shafts that fed into this room were wrong. They were coated with the same black organic resin from the nest, the substance dripping in thick, slow tendrils onto the deck below. A sickening realization dawned on me. The bridge door hadn't been the only way in or out. The creature had been moving through the ship's ventilation system the entire time. I hadn't trapped it outside. I had just raced it to its own back door. I wasn't alone in this room. The hum of the reactor core seemed to intensify, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the deck plates and into my bones. This was the heart of the Magellan, and it was about to become a battleground. I moved to the manual override console attached to the reactor's main housing. A thick, armored glass screen displayed the core's status.
A series of physical levers and dials were set below it, a last resort system for direct control. I slammed my fist on the emergency cover, shattering the plastic, and began the overload sequence. A klaxon began to blare, a jarring, repetitive whoop that echoed through the cavernous space. A synthesized voice, calm and detached, announced, "Warning, manual reactor overload initiated. Core detonation in 10 minutes." 10 minutes. To fight, to win, and to get out. The sound of screeching metal from above drew my attention. One of the resin-coated ventilation grates buckled, then burst open. The creature dropped from the ceiling, landing with a heavy, solid thud on the deck not 20 feet from me. It straightened up, its eyeless head sweeping the room before locking on to my position. It let out another of its piercing, chittering shrieks, a challenge and a death sentence, all in one. It lunged. I fired the pulse rifle, the plasma bolt catching it in the shoulder. It staggered but didn't stop. It was on me in a second. I swung the rifle like a club, the stock connecting with its head with a sickening crack. The blow would have killed a man, but the creature barely flinched. A clawed hand shot out, grabbing the rifle and ripping it from my grasp. The weapon clattered across the room, useless. I scrambled backward, putting a large coolant pipe between us. The creature flowed around it, its movements impossibly fluid. I was out of options, armed with nothing but my wits. My eyes darted around the engine room, a chaotic library of industrial machinery. I spotted a pressure release valve on the pipe next to me, its large red wheel beckoning. As the creature lunged again, I spun the wheel with all my strength. A jet of superheated steam erupted from the valve, blasting directly into the creature's face. It recoiled with a screech of genuine pain, a section of its chitinous headplate blistering and peeling away. It gave me an opening. I grabbed a heavy, industrial welding cutter from a nearby workbench, its power cord trailing behind me. It was clumsy and heavy, but its tip glowed with a fierce, white-hot energy. The creature, enraged, came at me again, more cautiously this time. We circled each other around the humming reactor core, a deadly dance between man and monster. It lashed out with its claws. I parried with the glowing tip of the cutter, the scent of vaporized chitin filling the air. It was stronger, faster, but I was desperate, fueled by a terror so pure it had become a kind of strength. "Core temperature rising," the ship's computer announced blandly. "Detonation in 5 minutes." During one of our frantic exchanges, I stumbled backward, close to the reactor core itself. A stream of blue-white plasma, part of the core's magnetic containment and cooling system, arced between two conduits near the floor. The creature, in its haste to get to me, recoiled from the plasma stream as if it had been struck by lightning, chittering in agony. And then I saw it. Its weakness. It wasn't just heat, it was this specific kind of energy. The raw, unshielded plasma of the reactor core was poison to it. A new plan, a better plan, clicked into place in my mind. Forget blowing up the ship. I could turn the reactor itself into a directed weapon. The schematics I had memorized on the bridge flooded my thoughts. There was an emergency plasma venting system, designed to jettison overheated plasma into space in case of a catastrophic failure. But the vents could be redirected. They could be rerouted to flush the main engineering corridor, the only way out of this room. Detonation in 3 minutes. I needed to get the creature into that corridor. I feinted to the left, then lunged forward, not at the creature, but at its leg. I drove the white-hot tip of the welding cutter deep into its thigh. It let out a deafening, soul-shattering shriek, and its leg buckled. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was painful, debilitating. It scrambled backward, instinctively retreating from the source of its pain, away from the reactor, and into the mouth of the main exit corridor. It was exactly where I wanted it. I left the cutter embedded in its leg and sprinted for a control junction on the far side of the reactor. The trap was set. Now I just had to spring it. Detonation in 2 minutes. All personnel evacuate immediately. The automated voice was a death knell, but my focus was absolute. I reached the plasma vent control station, a secondary panel covered in warning labels. A large, red manual lever was locked in place behind a safety cage. I tore the cage off its hinges with a grunt of exertion. The creature was getting back to its feet in the corridor, its wounded leg dragging, its chittering screams a symphony of pure hatred. It was starting to move toward me again, limping but still deadly. There was no time for finesse. I grabbed the lever with both hands and threw my entire body weight into it. Metal groaned in protest, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought it was rusted shut. Then, with a final, desperate heave, it moved. The lever slid down into the engage position with a heavy, final-sounding clunk. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entire engine room seemed to hold its breath. A deep, seismic hum emanated from the reactor core, a sound that felt like the ship itself was gathering its strength. The lights flickered, and the plasma streams within the containment field intensified, turning from blue-white to a blinding, furious violet. A section of the reactor housing slid open, revealing a conduit aimed directly down the main corridor. A torrent of raw, incandescent plasma erupted from the opening. It wasn't a beam, it was a tidal wave of pure energy, a river of starfire that filled the corridor from floor to ceiling. The creature was caught in the very center of the blast. Its hateful chittering was instantly transformed into a single, impossibly high-pitched shriek of ultimate agony. I saw its silhouette for a split second, thrashing wildly within the torrent of light, before it was simply unmade. Its body dissolved, its chitinous armor vaporized, its alien biology scoured from existence by the cleansing fire of a miniature sun. The shriek was cut off, and the roar of the plasma was the only sound. The blast lasted for 10 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The vent sealed, the reactor's hum subsided to a stable, if angry, whine, and the klaxons fell silent. "Overload sequence aborted, reactor stabilizing," the computer announced, its calm tone an absurd counterpoint to the scene of destruction. The corridor was a blackened, melted ruin. The walls glowed a dull cherry red. There was no sign of the creature, not a scrap, not a trace. Just the lingering smell of superheated metal. I stood there, swaying on my feet, every muscle screaming, my body bruised and burned. My hands shook uncontrollably, but I was alive. I had won. Before I could allow myself to feel relief, a cold, rational thought cut through the adrenaline. Make sure. I couldn't leave, couldn't even consider it until I was absolutely certain that the threat was neutralized. I had to go back to the nest. The journey back down to the cargo bay was surreal. The ship was heavily damaged now. Lights flickering, whole sections without power. The intense heat from the plasma burst had traveled through the ship's ventilation system. The organic resin that had coated the lower decks was now a dry, blackened char. It crumbled to dust under my boots, the sickly sweet smell replaced by the clean scent of ash. I reached the cargo bay and squeezed back through the warped doors. The transformation was absolute. The nest, the grotesque cathedral, had been sterilized. The pulsating, organic architecture was now a brittle, carbonized husk. The cocoons had all burst, their contents incinerated by the superheated air. It looked like a forest after a firestorm, a scene of utter, complete desolation. The throbbing heartbeat of the nest was gone. There was only silence. I walked to the center of the bay, to the spot where the creature's charred remains should have been. The plasma had been so intense, it had vaporized it completely. But as I scanned the ashen floor with my headlamp, I saw something. A single, palm-sized piece of its outer carapace, likely from its shoulder where my first pulse rifle shot had struck, had been blown clear of the main blast. It was blackened and cracked, but intact.
driven by some impulse I didn't understand, a need for proof, for a trophy, for a reminder that this had all been real. I bent down and picked it up. The edges were sharp. As I closed my hand around it, I felt a sharp prick in my palm. I barely registered it. With the fragment clutched in my fist, I made my way to the storage locker where the fuel cells were kept. They were untouched. I slung 2 of the heavy cells over my shoulder and began the long, final walk back to my escape pod, back to the airlock, back to my salvation. I was a victor leaving a conquered land.
The interior of my escape pod felt like a sanctuary. The airlock of the Magellan hissed shut behind me for the last time, and I was finally, truly free of that cursed ship. My movements were stiff and sore, my body a map of bruises and minor burns, but every ache was a testament to my survival. I worked on autopilot, my training taking over as I slotted the fresh fuel cells into the pod's power housing. The console flickered to life, bathing the small cabin in a steady, reassuring green light. All systems nominal, power at 100%, life support optimal. I strapped myself into the command chair, the familiar worn padding, a comfort I never thought I'd feel again. Before launching, I took one last look through the viewport. The CRV Magellan floated silently in the boneyard of ships, its lights dark once more, its hull scarred by my desperate battle. It was a tomb again, but this time I knew the ghost was truly gone. The crushing, oppressive silence of the cosmos no longer felt threatening. It felt peaceful. It felt like an ending. As I ran through the pre-flight checklist, a familiar procedure that should have been calming, I felt a sharp, sudden sting in the palm of my right hand, the one I'd used to pick up the piece of the creature's shell. I flexed my fingers, dismissing it. A splinter from the charred chitin, probably. A minor injury, the last price of my escape. Adrenaline and fatigue were making me oversensitive. Ignition sequence initiated, the pod's computer announced. With a gentle, powerful push from the thrusters, the pod pulled away from the Magellan. I watched the ghost ship recede, shrinking until it was just another silent derelict in the Sargasso Sea of stars. I inputted a course for the nearest major trade route, a point 2 days' travel from my current location. The nav computer confirmed the trajectory. I was going home. As the pod settled into its long-haul burn, the itching in my palm started. It wasn't a surface itch. It was deep, under the skin, a persistent, maddening tingle. I unsealed the glove of my EVA suit, the one that I hadn't even bothered to take off, and pulled it free. I needed to see the splinter, to dig it out, but there was no splinter. Instead, at the center of my palm, where the shard had pricked me, there was a small black spot. It wasn't a bruise, it was a discoloration, and emanating from it, like a dark web, were thin black lines snaking their way under my skin, tracing the path of my veins up my wrist. They looked exactly like the resinous growths that had infested the Magellan. My breath hitched. A cold, heavy dread, far worse than anything I had felt when facing the creature, settled in my stomach. A line from Dr. Reed's private data pad, a frantic, half-finished entry I had skimmed over in my haste, flashed in my mind with perfect, horrifying clarity. The replication isn't just through implantation. Discovered microscopic spores on the crystal surface. They can enter the bloodstream through any break in the skin. The host might not even be aware of the infection until the conversion is complete. I stared at my hand, at the dark veins spreading slowly, inexorably up my arm. The itching intensified, and I felt a faint, deep thrumming in my bones, a terrifyingly familiar rhythm. It was the same pulse I had felt in the deck of the nest, the song Peters had heard. I looked from my hand to the viewport, to the endless sea of stars ahead. The trade route, the bustling stations, the populated worlds of the core systems, they weren't a destination anymore. They were a target. I hadn't destroyed the monster. I hadn't cleansed the plague. I had become its ark. My desperate escape wasn't an ending. It was a delivery. And I was the invisible passenger carrying the seed of a silent, screaming end to everything I had been trying to return to.